in a remote military outpost buried deep beneath the Appalachian canopy, where secrets outweighed daylight and loyalty was measured in silence. A German shepherd with eyes like burned copper stood vigil beside a rusted gate. His name was Coda. No longer a soldier, no longer just a dog. Miles away, Elijah Moore, former sergeant, marked traitor, forgotten hero, watched the same sun rise over a nameless field. Haunted by the war they both survived and the brother they couldn't save. But fate wasn't done. One message, one hidden truth, and the dog who remembered everything. Before we begin, if stories of courage, betrayal, and redemption speak to you, like and subscribe. Then tell us where you're watching from, and what would you do if your only witness couldn't speak but never forgot? The air smelled of burnt gunpowder and damp earth as the helicopter's rotors cut through the dust-choked afternoon. In the barracks beneath the sunset sky, Sergeant Elijah Moore sat in silence, his black and tan German shepherd, Coda, resting loyally by his side. The echoes of battle still clung to his uniform, blood, sweat, the sharp scent of metal. But tonight there were no bullets, no commands. Only a stage, a podium, and the hollow echo of applause that didn't belong to him. He could hear the cheers from the camp's central square. Flags waved. The brass had polished their boots and their smiles. Elijah adjusted the collar of his fatigues, staring at his reflection in the dusty glass pane, decorated, honored, alive. But inside something felt fractured. He exhaled deeply and bent down to scratch behind Coda's ear. "They want to pin a medal on me, boy," he muttered. "But they don't know the half of it, do they?" Coda responded with a low, loyal rumble like he understood. Elijah's thoughts drifted back to that night in the desert. The ambush, the chaos, the fire. He had made it back, but someone hadn't. Sergeant Julian Cross, his closest friend since boot camp, had gone radio silent during the last wave. Command listed him as KIA, killed in action. But Elijah had seen something different. The heat of that night still danced behind his eyes. Cross wasn't dead. Not in the way they said. The celebration felt like a mockery. Elijah stood at the edge of the crowd, eyes narrow beneath his beret. Commander Rhodes took the podium, a thick-chested man with silver eagles on his shoulders and medals glittering like lies across his chest. "Tonight we honor bravery. We honor sacrifice." The crowd parted and all eyes turned toward him. A slow, hesitant walk to the front. Applause thundered like mortar fire. Elijah stood motionless as Rhodes pinned the Star of Valor onto his chest. "Your courage turned the tide of that mission. You saved lives," Rhodes said, his smile fixed like a politician's promise. But Elijah's lips remained still. No salute, no words of thanks. Instead, he reached up and unclasped the medal, handing it back. "Permission to decline, sir." The silence was sudden, awkward, palpable. Rhodes's smile faltered. "Excuse me, Sergeant?" Elijah met his eyes. "I didn't earn this alone. One of ours didn't come home. Until I know what happened to Sergeant Cross, I'm not celebrating anything." Rhodes' jaw tightened. A few chuckles died in the throats of the brass nearby. "That's highly irregular." Elijah didn't flinch. He was Cross disappearing without a trace. Later that evening, Elijah stood at the edge of the base near the radio shack. Coda sat alert, eyes scanning the perimeter. The desert wind cut cold across the camp. Elijah held a small USB drive in his hand, the kind used for bodycam logs and encrypted comms. He'd found it while cleaning out Cross's quarters after the mission. It was slipped behind a false panel in Julian's duffel bag. No one else had noticed. He plugged it into the terminal under the cloak of darkness. The screen blinked. Files appeared. One in particular stood out. A classified, time-stamped 2 nights before the final op. Elijah clicked. The video feed opened with static. Then the familiar grim face of Julian Cross filled the screen. His voice was low, urgent. "If they're saying this, it means something went wrong. They're hiding something deep inside this op. This isn't a rescue. It's a wipe. They want no witnesses. If I don't make it out, find the shepherd." The footage ended. Elijah's fingers gripped the console's edge. His pulse hammered in his ears. "Find the shepherd," the phrase repeated in his mind like a riddle. A call sign, a cogni, or something else entirely. The next morning, as the camp stirred, Elijah sat on the steps of the barracks. Coda curled beside him. Sunrise cast a blood-orange glow across the base, and for the first time in weeks, Elijah didn't feel pride. He felt hunted. Something was wrong in the chain of command. The lies were stacking, and Cross had known it, had died for it. He looked down at Coda. "You saved me once," he said quietly. "Looks like I'm gonna need you again." Across the square, Commander Rhodes stood speaking with two unfamiliar men. Plain clothes, clean cuts, cold eyes. One of them glanced toward Elijah and nodded. Just once. The hunt had begun. The video wouldn't leave Elijah's mind. Cross's voice, hoarse, desperate, unfinished, lingered like a ghost in every breath Elijah took. "Find the shepherd." That phrase haunted him through the next sunrise, through the drills, through the empty accolades. Something about it itched beneath his skin. He didn't sleep. Instead, he returned to the secure terminal under the cover of darkness again. Coda lying silently at the door like a breathing shadow. He'd been assigned access to squad comm logs and cam feeds during recon. They still hadn't revoked those privileges. Yet, clicking through layers of encrypted video footage, he replayed the team's final mission. Camera angles overlapped helmet cams, drone feeds, motion capture from recon towers. As his eyes combed through the timeline, he suddenly stopped. Frame 417. Julian Cross wasn't lying face down in the dust like they claimed. He was moving. Barely. His left hand twitched. Then, from the shadow behind a half-destroyed bunker wall, two figures emerged. Not enemies, at least not wearing the uniform of the known opposition. Tactical black, silent, efficient. One knelt beside Cross, jabbing something into his neck, while the other scanned the area with a palm-sized device. Cross's body went limp. They dragged him out of frame. The time code was clear. The official log said the extraction occurred 5 minutes earlier. The body was never found. Elijah leaned back from the screen, heart pounding against his ribs like a drumbeat of panic and fury. His fists clenched. His mouth went dry. Julian had been taken. This wasn't battlefield loss, this was abduction inside a military operation. And no one had said a word. Coda let out a low growl, ears twitching. Someone was coming. Quickly, Elijah closed the files, wiped the cache, and stood as the door opened. Lieutenant Hammond walked in, young, pressed, sharp as a blade but dull in soul. "More," he said, eyes like glass. "Commander Rhodes wants to see you. Now." The walk to the CO's tent felt longer than usual. 2 MPs stood at the entrance, too formal for a routine meeting. Inside, Rhodes didn't bother to sit. The air smelled of disinfectant and unspoken accusations. "You accessed restricted archives last night," he said flatly. "Care to explain?" Elijah didn't blink. "I was reviewing my own mission footage. Standard protocol after high-casualty ops." Rhodes stepped closer. His voice remained even, but it was the calm before a storm. "You accessed helmet cam footage time-stamped after debrief. Classified material. You bypassed the security wall." "That's not standard." Elijah held his ground. "I saw something that contradicts the official report on Cross's death." Rhodes's eyes narrowed. "Sergeant Cross is dead. You were there." Elijah's jaw tensed. "I was there, and I saw him alive, dragged off by 2 unknown operators. I have questions." Rhodes slammed a folder onto the table between them. "This base runs on discipline, not questions. You've been reassigned." Elijah's pulse froze. What? He knew resistance wouldn't work here. Not now. The message was clear. Shut up or disappear. He saluted stiffly and walked out. 30 minutes later, Elijah stood on the tarmac. The plane growled beside him like a mechanical beast preparing to swallow him whole. Soldiers loaded crates. No one looked at him. Coda sat by his boots, sensing the tension. The ramp lowered. A crewman waved them aboard. The flight was long, silent, heavy. Elijah sat with his back straight, eyes fixed on nothing, his mind spinning with questions in the face of Julian Cross as he was dragged into darkness. Find the shepherd. What did it mean? Why had Rhodes shut him down so hard? What did they know that he didn't? Fort Revere felt like exile. It was clean, polished, soulless. Rows of cubicles hummed with clerical drone. Logistics officers with wide ties and narrow vision filled the halls. Elijah was assigned to civilian military resource liaison coordination, which meant inputting shipment data and signing off on non-lethal equipment requests. A soldier stripped of teeth. He kept his head down. For a week. Then, on a Friday morning, he opened a supply crate destined for an offshore radar station. Something felt off. The inventory manifest said weather graze fiber. Cable inside were cold steel tubes with no labels. Coda sniffed the crate, then growled a deep, instinctive growl that only came when something was wrong. Elijah reached inside, pulled one out. The weight wasn't right. The seal was military but foreign. He placed it gently on the table and knocked twice. A hollow echo. Not fiber cable. Later that evening, after the compound had gone quiet, Elijah returned to the warehouse. This time, he brought bolt cutters. Inside the crate's false bottom, he found 3 unmarked vials sealed in thermal foam, a flash drive taped beneath them. He pocketed the drive and reassembled the crate. Coda stood silently at the entrance, alert. In his quarters, he plugged the drive into his personal laptop completely offline. The contents opened to a single folder labeled Shepherd_eyes only. His chest tightened, a video file loaded, a grainy feed from a high-altitude drone. Coordinates flashed in the corner. A camp in the desert, one he recognized from Cross's last mission. Zoomed in, the image showed something chilling. A fenced compound, armed guards. And in the center, chained to a metal post beneath floodlights, barely conscious, was Julian Cross. Elijah froze. His hands trembled. He hit pause, then rewind. The image was rough, but there was no mistake. Cross was alive, and he was being held. Coda let out a whine, pacing slightly. Elijah stood, pacing too. This wasn't just a cover-up. This was captivity, internal black ops. Or worse. And the worst part? The camp wasn't on any map. Not a US facility. Not foreign. Something else entirely. There was a knock at the door. A code knock. 3 slow, 2 fast. The handle turned. The door creaked open slower than it should have, and Elijah's finger hovered just above the trigger. Coda's growl deepened, but it wasn't a growl of panic. It was recognition. A silhouette stepped inside, tall, broad, the kind of posture trained through shared fire and drills. Elijah relaxed for just a second when he recognized the man. Staff Sergeant Malik Dorsey. They had trained together, served side by side in Kandahar, even shared foxholes in the monsoon-soaked trenches of the jungle campaign 2 years prior. Dorsey? Elijah asked, confused, lowering the pistol slightly. What the hell are you doing here? Dorsey didn't answer. His steps were measured, heavy boots against concrete, and his eyes didn't match the reunion. They were cold, unreadable. Then Elijah saw the glint of metal shift under his jacket. Too quick, too close blade. Instinct kicked in. Elijah dropped the laptop and sidestepped as Dorsey lunged forward. The combat knife sliced the air, missing Elijah's throat by a hair. Coda barked and launched forward for... Elijah used the moment to slam his shoulder into Dorsey's chest, sending them both into a shelf of rations that toppled with a crash loud enough to wake the entire base. You're making a mistake, Elijah growled, pinning the man's wrist, trying to disarm him without drawing blood. Dorsey snarled like a man possessed. You should have kept your mouth shut more. That single line made it crystal clear this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an assignment. A message. They struggled for control, bodies crashing into boxes and crates of military gear. Coda circled, barking in confusion, trying to find the moment to intervene without injury. Dorsey was strong still, in peak condition, but Elijah fought with desperation. The truth burned in his chest like fire. After a brutal slam into a wall of steel lockers, Elijah finally got the upper hand and forced the blade from Dorsey's grasp. It clattered to the floor, but before Elijah could restrain him, floodlights roared on overhead. Alarms blared. Doors slammed open, boots thundered. Voices shouted, and before he could say a word, Elijah found himself surrounded. The woman rose hastily, raising his arms. Coda backed up into a crouch, growling low, protective but obedient. Dorsey, now sitting up and clutching a manufactured head wound, pointed with shaking fingers. He attacked me, said he knew what really happened in the desert, he snapped. Elijah opened his mouth to speak, but 2 MPs closed in, twisting his arms behind his back, cuffing him fast and hard. Wait, this is a setup, he protested. No one listened. He was marched out under floodlight glare, blood trickling from a cut above his brow. Coda whimpering behind him. Through the commotion, he saw Dorsey speaking with someone just out of frame, a shadow leaning against the building with arms crossed and a radio clipped to his vest. The figure didn't step into the light, but Elijah saw the glint of a watch, and something in his gut twisted violently. Rhodes? The next 12 hours blurred into a bureaucratic whirlwind of interrogation rooms, fluorescent lights, and cold coffee left untouched. They accused until Elijah didn't know if the ringing in his ears was from the beating or the betrayal. But it wasn't until they dropped the bag onto the table that everything shifted. "Recognize this?" one of the officers asked. Elijah looked at his backpack. He nodded. "It's mine." The man opened it slowly, theatrically, like a magician about to pull off a trick no one asked for. Inside was a small black hard drive, sleek, new, clearly placed. The officer plugged it into a military-grade tablet. "Encrypted, but not enough," he said with a smirk, clicking through the files. Elijah leaned forward, trying to make out the screen. Project Blackfall, coordinates, names of U.S. asset, commission codes, to be delivered to Ewan marked Chestern Control. A silent boom echoed in Elijah's chest. "That's not mine," he said, his voice calm, too calm, the kind of calm that builds when you've been set up so perfectly it almost impresses you. "I've never seen those files. Someone planted them." The interrogator chuckled. "Yeah? Then explain how it got in your personal gear, Sergeant. Your signature logs the last access. Same date you requested leave from Fort Revere. Real convenient." Elijah stared him down. "If I wanted to sell out this country, I wouldn't be sitting here unarmed with my dog asleep in the next room. I'm telling you, you're not telling us anything." The man cut him off. "You've been talking too much already. Asking questions you weren't supposed to. Looking where you shouldn't. You got curious more, and now you're caught." They left him cuffed to the table for hours. No food, no water. Coda hadn't been brought in. That worried him more than anything. His mind reeled through possibilities. Dorsey's, Rhodes, the file, Cross. They were tying him to treason, not just to silence him but to erase the truth. Later that night he was escorted to a holding cell on the edge of the base. Not military detention, civilian grade. Cold cement, a narrow bunk bolted to the wall, a single high window too small for hope. They stripped him of his gear, his badges, his rank. But not his thoughts, and not his memory. He replayed the attack again and again. Dorsey's expression, the blade, the phrase, "You should have kept your mouth shut." That meant Rhodes was scared. That meant Elijah was closer to something than they wanted. He sat back on the bunk, fists clenched in his lap. Somewhere out there, Cross was alive. He glanced toward the corner. A vent near the floor. A faint sound. Soft, familiar. A scratch, then a breath. Then, the scratching continued, subtle but deliberate, until Elijah knelt down near the vent and whispered, "Coda?" The low whimper that answered him was all he needed. Somehow, impossibly, his dog had found him. He didn't know how Coda had escaped containment or who had led him near the cell, but none of that mattered. All he knew was that the bond between them, forged in fire and chaos, had endured. The sound faded as footsteps echoed down the hallway as two guards approached. One unlocked the heavy steel door while the other stepped in with cuffs and a flat expression. "Transfer order just came down," the man said, eyes unmoved. "You're being moved to another facility pending trial." Elijah didn't speak. He knew better. He allowed them to cuff him without resistance, keeping his eyes forward. But his mind was racing. A transfer in the middle of the night? That was never procedure. The guards didn't wear standard MP insignia. Their boots weren't regulation issue. Something stank, and it wasn't just the diesel fuel hanging in the air. They shoved him into the back of a blacked-out military transport van and slammed the doors. No windows. Just steel walls and two silent shadows riding with him. Elijah sat still, eyes adjusting to the dim red light overhead, while the engine rumbled to life and they began to move. His mind tracked the route by vibration, sharp angle of lefts and rights. But soon, they veered off pavement dirt road. No official route would take them that way. One of the guards muttered into his comms, "Approaching drop point." Elijah's spine went cold. He leaned forward slightly. "Drop point? Since when do military prisoners have drop points?" The guard didn't answer. The other unlatched the side panel and began pulling something out. Elijah squinted. It wasn't documentation, it was a tarp, and beneath it, a shovel that confirmed it. They weren't transporting him, they were burying him. No trial, no courtroom, just a silent execution in the middle of nowhere. The van jerked to a halt, the rear doors opened and moonlight spilled in. They were in the woods. Dense, isolated, no towers, no outposts, just trees and shadow. One of the guards yanked Elijah to his feet and shoved him outside. The other pointed toward a patch of turned earth. "Walk," he said. Elijah stared at the shallow pit. "You're not even going to make it look like an accident?" he asked, voice steady but laced with contempt. "This is the best you could do? Orders are orders," the first replied coldly. "Sometimes clean is messy." They pulled him toward the edge. One raised his sidearm. "Any last words?" Elijah clenched his fists. "Yeah, you boys ever been hunted before?" The guard frowned. "What?" Then the forest exploded. A blur of muscle and fury shot from the shadows. "Coda." He hit the first man low, teeth driving into the thigh, dragging him screaming to the ground. The pistol discharged wildly into the air. 2 rounds lost to the sky. The second guard turned and aimed at the charging shepherd. But Elijah was faster. He twisted his wrist hard, breaking the weak joint in his cuffs, a trick he'd learned in a training course meant for interrogation. Before the second guard could fire, Elijah slammed his shoulder into him, sending both men tumbling. The weapons skittered across the dirt. The first man tried to stand, but Coda lunged again, this time clamping onto the wrist that held the knife, snarling as he pinned the man to the ground. Elijah rolled over, grabbing the fallen sidearm and trained it on the second man, now scrambling backward. "Don't," Elijah growled. The man froze. "We were told you were compromised," he said, fear bleeding into his voice. "They said you were going to leak critical." He came from his channel. "Private encryption." I just followed. A sharp crack rang out. The man's eyes went wide, then vacant, a bloom of red appearing on his chest. Elijah dove for cover as a third shot whizzed past. There was another shooter, a cleanup man. Elijah scanned the tree line, grabbing the downed man's radio. "You seeing this, Coda?" The dog growled, dragging the first guard deeper into cover behind the van. Elijah dashed toward the nearest rock formation, bullets clipping bark and thudding into dirt behind him. Someone was using a suppressed rifle. Trained, quiet, probably recon-trained. They wanted this quick, silent, buried. He spotted the muzzle flash behind a thicket 30 yards out. Dropping to one knee, he fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. The flashes stopped. Silence reclaimed the clearing. Elijah rose slowly, weapon aimed, eyes sharp, waiting for movement. Nothing. Coda returned to his side, panting, his fur streaked with dirt and sweat but uninjured. Elijah didn't waste time. He grabbed the keys from the second guard's corpse, unshackled himself and popped open the van's front panel. Inside was a satellite phone. Encrypted, still active. He crushed it underfoot. Too risky. Then he turned to the rear compartment, scanning for useful gear maps, supplies, munitions. They'd stripped the van for a one-way trip. No backups, no paper trail. He pulled the bodies into the shallow pit they'd intended for him and kicked the tarp over them. Coda stood watch silently, eyes fixed on the tree line as if expecting another wave. "Let's move," Elijah said quietly, tapping Coda's flank. "We've been off-leash long enough." They disappeared into the trees under the cover of night, the moon above barely breaking through the branches, the silence around them thick with questions and the scent of betrayal. Somewhere deeper in the woods, another figure was moving, watching, and ahead, beneath layers of shadows and secrets, Elijah knew the truth was waiting, coiled, hidden, dangerous. The forest thickened around them as Elijah and Coda pushed deeper into the darkness, every snapped branch and rustling leaf sharpening their instincts. The night had grown heavier, colder, thick with the breath of something old and long forgotten. Elijah moved quietly, ducking under branches and keeping to the shadows, with Coda always a few steps ahead, ears twitching, nose low to the ground, his behavior more focused than usual. It wasn't just evasion anymore, he was tracking something. Elijah felt it in the rhythm of the dog's steps, in the way he paused at certain trees, sniffed the air, then continued. This wasn't random. Coda had a destination in mind. They had walked for nearly 2 hours, evading patrol drones, avoiding thermal spots, and skirting a decommissioned fence line when Elijah saw it, a rusted sign half swallowed by moss and vines. For Sable, K9, Advanced Behavioral Unit, deactivated, 2007. Elijah stopped cold. He knew that name. Everyone in Special Operations had heard the story. A classified canine training facility deep in a restricted zone. Shut down after an unexplained explosion that killed 6 personnel and destroyed half the compound. No one ever spoke about what caused it, only that it had been buried literally and politically. But Coda was walking straight into it without hesitation. Elijah followed as the trees gave way to broken asphalt and collapsed fencing. The bones of the facility emerged slowly, like the skeleton of something massive and once glorious. Barracks crushed by fallen trees, kennel cages with doors twisted open by time, satellite dishes coated in rust like oxidized scars, and silence. Not the kind born from emptiness, but the loaded, haunted quiet of places that remember. Coda stopped near what used to be the mess hall and sniffed the air with purpose. Then he turned sharply and bounded toward a broken stairwell leading underground, his claws clicking against concrete worn smooth by age. Elijah hesitated. "You sure about this, boy?" Coda didn't look back. He vanished into the dark. Elijah pulled a flashlight from his belt and followed, one hand on his sidearm, every step taking him further from the world above and deeper into a place not meant to be revisited. The stairwell twisted downward for at least 30 feet before ending in a warped steel door slightly ajar. Beyond it lay a narrow corridor, lined with pipes dripping condensation and emergency lights long dead. Coda moved with eerie certainty, navigating the corridor like he remembered it. Elijah caught a scent beneath the mildew and mold chemicals. Burned rubber. Machine oil. Recent. Someone had been here. They entered a larger chamber, the remains of a subterranean command center. Consoles lined the walls, most shattered or dark, but one workstation flickered faintly with reserve power. A thick monitor hummed low as static danced across the screen. Elijah approached slowly. Coda sat beside the console, watching the monitor like a soldier at guard. Elijah tapped the keyboard. Nothing. He reached beneath the panel and felt for the manual override he knew these systems had. Click. The screen blinked. Then a file tree appeared. Archive_drive_K9. Access code required. He entered the last 4 digits of Cross's military ID. Nothing. Then he remembered the footage from the drone. Find the Shepherd. He typed Shepherd_17. The screen unlocked. Dozens of video logs and documents opened, most tagged redacted or classified _05. But one folder was marked in yellow, Operation Glasswall. Elijah clicked. The first video opened to grainy footage of a dog in a training cage, fitted with a neural harness, and exposed to a series of flashing images. Beside him stood 2 men in lab coats and one in a black uniform with no insignia. The footage had a date, January 2007, 2 weeks before the override response is stabilizing. He's resisting but adapting. Try the next sequence. The dog convulsed briefly, then steadied, eyes wide and unblinking. Elijah flipped through the documents. Project Glasswolf was not a training initiative. It was a behavior override program using experimental neural triggers on select canine units to test battlefield loyalty augmentation, turning dogs into autonomous decision-makers with embedded subroutines. Biological programming. Weaponized instinct. But something went wrong. One entry buried deep in the logs, detailed during a stress trial. Uncontrolled aggression, system feedback overload resulting in handler fatalities. The dog listed, Coda's littermate subject K9721. Elijah turned to Coda slowly. "You were part of this," he whispered. Coda didn't move, didn't deny it. The look in his eyes wasn't guilt, it was something deeper, knowing. Protecting. The last video was darker. A shaky cam pointed at a secret holding cell beneath the facility, showing a restrained man with bruises and a feeding tube, Julian Cross. A date stamp from just 3 months ago. Subject is stable but uncooperative. A voice said off-screen. Previous attempts at neural pairing failed. Recommend isolation until memory suppression is complete. Elijah's blood ran cold. They weren't just using dogs. They were using people. Testing, breaking, rewiring. Fort Sable never closed, it just went underground. And Cross had been brought here, used, experimented on. Maybe still here. But the deeper implication twisted in his gut. Coda had led him to this. Not by accident. By memory. Behind the control panel, Elijah found a dusty storage cabinet. Inside were backup drives sealed in anti-access. He pocketed one, slid it into his backpack, and turned to Coda. "We can't stay here." A low metallic click echoed behind them. They weren't alone anymore. The click echoed through the command room like a thunderbolt through dead air. And Elijah's body turned instinctively, sidearm raised, eyes scanning the shadows. Coda stepped forward first, teeth bared, body low, and then from behind the crushed filing cabinets a single figure emerged with hands raised and a hood over his head. "Don't shoot," the man croaked. "I'm not one of them." Elijah didn't lower his weapon. "Then why are you here?" The man's voice was dry, hoarse, like someone who hadn't used words in days. "Because I used to be," he said. "I worked for the unit, Blackridge Division. You wouldn't know the name, no one outside their need-to-know circle does. But I know what they did to your friend. And your dog?" Elijah narrowed his eyes. "You were part of Glasswolf?" The man nodded. "Only for a short time. I ran comms and logistics. Thought we were training a new generation of canine response units. I didn't know they'd start on humans." Elijah stepped forward slowly. "Where's Cross?" The man flinched. "Dead, I think. Or broken in a way that makes no difference. They were running reconditioning cycles by the time I left." He wouldn't talk, wouldn't bend. That's when they brought in the higher-level override teams. "And Rhodes?" Elijah's voice was sharp. "How deep is he in this?" The man looked up for the first time, and there was a strange pity in his face. "He's not just involved, it's his experiment." That night, Elijah uploaded the Glasswolf archive from the retrieved drive into a private terminal deep beneath the ruins, protected by leftover encryption from the facility's blackout nodes. Then, he powered on a military satellite communicator salvaged from the dead comms officer they'd found earlier, and rerouted the frequency through a burned-out Russian weather station to mask the origin. He typed her number slowly, deliberately, the way one says a prayer not to be heard by the wrong gods. Captain Naomi Trent, former JAG officer, brilliant, precise, ruthless in court. She had also been his everything once, until Kandahar, until the last deployment, until he didn't come home when he should have. Elijah had written the goodbye she never answered. Now, he needed her more than he'd ever wanted her. The call connected. For a full 10 seconds there was nothing but static. Then her voice came through low, cautious, unmistakable. "This channel is restricted, identify yourself." "It's me," Elijah said. "More." There was a pause, then a breath, then silence. "You're dead," she said flatly. "Everyone says you're dead or disappeared or worse." "Not dead," he replied. "Just because you're the only one I trust to open a case they've tried to erase from existence." Glasswolf, her voice dropped. "I heard rumors, but I thought it was shut down. It wasn't, it just went deeper. I have footage, documents, I have Cross's last known location. I need this scene. I need it official." Naomi exhaled slowly. "I'll need leverage, I'll need a witness. The system eats digital files for breakfast. I need someone real." Elijah hesitated. "I might have someone, but they won't talk unless..." "Unless what?" "Unless Coda confirms them." Another pause. "You trust your dog more than people?" "I do," Elijah said. "And you should too." 2 nights later, in a truck disguised as a meat delivery vehicle, Elijah crossed into a decommissioned airstrip in rural Nevada, where Naomi had arranged a safe contact. She greeted him in civilian clothes, sunglasses, and tension wrapped in silence. She didn't hug him, didn't smile, but she opened the door. That was enough. Coda hopped down beside him, alert as ever. They entered an abandoned flight tower converted into a provisional legal node. Inside, a man sat hunched in a chair, hoodie drawn up, fingers twitching. Naomi stepped aside. "He's agreed to talk. Says he was a handler here during the first canine augmentation trials. But he wants verification. He wants Coda to react the same way he did before. To know you're not feeding him lies." Elijah turned to the man. "Name? Call me Lancer. You worked with Coda?" "3 Rhodes. Neural stim overrides. It's buried in his training sublayer. He responds to trigger sequences, but not the way you think. Not verbal, movement-based, a pattern, a loop." Elijah looked down. "Show me." Lancer stood slowly and performed 3 distinct gestures. 2 steps forward, palm extended, half turn, knee drop, hand flat to the chest. Kota blinked, ears twitching. Sagai part tail still, chest rigid, his head tilted and his right paw lifted halfway off the ground, an old command sequence from the early behavioral codes. Elijah's breath caught. Kota remembered, but more importantly, Kota confirmed this man had been with him before the wipe. Naomi stepped forward. That's enough for me. They sat for 6 hours as Lancer detailed the inner workings of the Glasswall chain, how handlers were replaced by behavioral loops, how Cross had been moved from one black site to another for failing integration, how Rhodes had overseen at least 4 test phases under the codename Shepard. Naomi's fingers never stopped typing, every word logged, every name entered, every location mapped. But there was one more step. A testimony needed to be filed inside a courtroom, even a closed one. A judge needed to be involved. She would push for a sealed review, and if approved, demand a military tribunal for war crimes under Article 118. But it needed to happen fast. If Rhodes caught wind of this going formal, he would erase everyone. Do we have time? Elijah asked, voice taut. Naomi stood, packing her files. Barely. If your dog hadn't confirmed him, I would have walked. But now, we move. Outside, thunder rolled over the desert sky, and in the east, helicopters began to rise, military-marked, but unannounced. Too many to be coincidence. Naomi's eyes darted toward the clouds. We've been found. The courthouse felt more like a fortress than a seat of justice, its cold marble floors and steel detectors humming with paranoia. Naomi had fought hard to get the session classified, pushing the tribunal through a rarely used security clause buried in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Only 6 people were allowed inside the chamber. 2 judges, Naomi as the defense, a prosecution rep from Central Command, the witness Lancer, and Elijah seated beside Kota at the defense table. No cameras, no observers. The air was tight with silence, a kind of silence that precedes either justice or death. Naomi stood, calm and lethal in her navy blue suit, and addressed the tribunal with her opening. We are not here to speculate. We are here to unearth. She pointed to Elijah. The client was framed for crimes born from a system designed to manipulate not only animals, but soldiers, truth, and loyalty itself. You'll see evidence of that, and you'll hear it directly from someone who lived it. The judges, both stone-faced colonels with decades in uniform, nodded. The prosecution made no motion to object. Not yet. The trap hadn't sprung. Lancer was escorted to the stand under heavy guard. Though the guards were ceremonial, no one in the room trusted anyone. His hands trembled slightly as he raised them for the oath. Do you swear to tell the truth? The words echoed through the sealed chamber. He nodded. I do. Naomi approached, voice steady. State your role in Project Glasswolf. Comms and handler logistics, he replied, glancing toward Kota, who sat perfectly still, alert, eyes never blinked. I was part of the original trials. I saw what they did. I delivered Subject 721. Kota between sectors. I watched neural protocols fail. I saw the impact on handlers like Cross. And I saw Rhodes sign every single authorization form. The prosecution stirred. Objection. Their voice rang out, overruled. Continue. Lancer breathed deep. Project Glasswolf was never about improvement. It was control. Dogs like Kota weren't just trained. They were rewritten. Handlers were monitored. When one resisted like Cross, they were removed. Naomi leaned in. Removed how? Either neural reprogramming or disposal. Cross didn't bend, so they isolated him. Where? I don't know. Then how do you know he's gone? Because the day he disappeared, Rhodes sent out a coded kill switch to the outpost. It was tagged Shepard_0. I intercepted it. Naomi looked back at Elijah. He nodded once. It was what they needed. She turned back to the bench. Your Honors, we request that the data logs tied to that code be pulled from encrypted storage under the authority of this court. The lead judge opened his mouth to respond. Then it happened. The window cracked. A whip-like sound split the room. Lancer's chest exploded in red. He collapsed backward, eyes wide, mouth still moving as if the truth hadn't finished leaving his lips. Screams echoed. The prosecution ducked. Naomi threw herself in front of Elijah. Kota lunged over the table, barking ferociously. teeth bared toward the high glass dome now spiderwebbed with a sniper's exit wound. Pigs fell through the room, securing doors, shouting for lockdown. But it was already too late. The witness was dead. Pension Wallace was the first to reach him, kneeling beside the dying man, whose hand twitched, reaching for something inside his jacket. Elijah helped him, blood smearing his fingers as he pulled out a stained night card. Lancer coughed once, blood dripping from his lips. His voice broke. Then he whispered something into Coda's ear. The dog stilled, eyes locked. Then Lancer fell silent. Naomi knelt beside Elijah. "What is it?" Elijah looked at the note card. On it was a string of alphanumeric characters, written in shaky handwriting. 4F3, code 17.8 Delta, walk. It meant nothing, but Coda stood now, moving slowly to the door, tail rigid, muscles tense. "He knows," Elijah said. "Whatever it is, it's not for us. It's for him." Coda barked once, then turned back to face Elijah. Elijah stared at the code again. "Walk Delta walk, it's a training command," he said. "Pattern-based. Coda must have been programmed to respond to it." He crouched in front of the dog. "Show me, buddy. Show me where it leads." The tribunal was disbanded in chaos. The sniper was never found. The rooftop cleaned, shell casing removed. Digital camera wiped professional. Naomi had just enough time to make the tribunal preserve evidence already entered into record. The death of the key witness had jeopardized the trial, but not ended it. The judges, perhaps shaken, had not dismissed the case, only paused it. But Rhodes had made his move, and now Elijah had to make his. That night, back at the safe house Naomi arranged 2 miles outside Fort Dewey, Elijah placed the code on the table, watching Coda stare at it. He laid out a field map satellite layout of the terrain around Fort Sable and its neighboring facilities. Coda sniffed the map, then placed his paw over a wooded section marked as Zone 4 F3. Elijah's eyes widened. "That zone's been sealed since 2010, Naomi said behind him. "Nothing's moved through there except black choppers and rumor." "Then, that's where we're going." Before they left, Elijah pulled a cloth-wrapped bundle from his go-bag. Inside was the old training collar Coda wore back during their second deployment. Long decommissioned, with a snapped braided choke cord still hanging from the loop. He stared at the cord, remembering the last mission before Cross disappeared. Julian had given him that cord, saying, "It's marked Coda's first mission unit, just in case we forget where he came from." Elijah turned it over and found something he had never noticed before. A small burnished metal bead embedded in the weave, barely visible. He pried it out with a knife. On the underside there was an etching, 721 SJ cross-cycle file. Coda had worn this same identifier, and the code matched the same serial assigned to the cross-transfer manifest Elijah had never been able to access. The line connected. Coda had been tied to Cross, not just by unit but by cycle. They'd been paired in the original override pairing protocol. That meant Coda had once been programmed to protect Cross at all costs. Elijah looked at the map, then at the dog, then back at Naomi. "He's still alive," he said. "They wouldn't keep that link open if they didn't need something from him." Naomi didn't blink. "Then we follow the code." Coda stood and began to walk. The tribunal was hastily reconvened under heightened security, now relocated to a hardened debriefing room within Fort Dewey's military intelligence annex. No windows, no air circulation beyond filtered vents, and no access to unsecured channels. Naomi stood firm, her files thicker now, her voice sharper, while Elijah paced like a caged predator, Coda following his every step with eyes that saw more than most men ever could. The judges returned without robes, dressed in combat-grade fatigues, suggesting that the case had escalated beyond legal protocol and into national threat territory. Naomi had demanded a full review of Project Glasswolf and its aftermath, citing the death of the witness as obstruction of justice and presenting the blood-stained note card as admissible evidence. And the tribunal, no longer able to deny the gravity, had agreed to hear one final testimony, an authorized expert from within the original chain of command, allegedly here to clarify military intentions and debunk conspiracy. His name was Colonel Vincent Strayer. The door opened with a hydraulic hiss and Strayer entered, crisp and precise in every line of his uniform. Silver clusters adorned his chest, and his walk was the kind of measured arrogance only decades of untouchable rank could afford. He greeted the judges with subtle nods, bypassed Naomi without a glance, and stopped directly in front of Elijah with a ghost of a smile. "Sergeant Moore," he said. Strayer took the witness stand and began his testimony, laying out a calculated narrative that painted Project Glasswolf as an abandoned research initiative designed for behavioral synchronization, a well-intentioned, though ultimately flawed, exploration into enhanced interspecies military operations. He claimed no involvement in override protocols, no knowledge of human testing, and certainly no record of Sergeant Cross beyond his official KIA status. Naomi grilled him on the inconsistencies, especially the destruction date of Force Sable, which Strayer claimed occurred 6 months prior to the Cross disappearance, yet Elijah had footage proving otherwise. Strayer shifted blame onto unauthorized rogue elements that had supposedly hijacked the project. It was going smoothly for him until Coda moved. No bark, no warning, just a sudden, precise leap across the chamber, his claws scratching against the polished floor as he launched over the defense table and collided squarely into Strayer's chest. The colonel fell hard, the back of his head striking the wall chair shattering beneath him. Coda growled, teeth bared, eyes locked onto Strayer's throat. Shouts erupted, MPs swarming, weapons drawn. Elijah moved faster. "Stand down," he roared, stepping between them. "Don't touch that dog." Naomi jumped between the muzzle of a soldier's M4 and Coda's flank. "Hold fire," she commanded. "You shoot, you'll be burying your last witness." Strayer groaned, struggling beneath the weight of the dog, and for the first time his expression cracked, not pain but fear. Real, primal, buried deep fear. Blood stained his sleeve where Coda's jaw had grazed it. Not from an attack but from a ripping gesture, something specific, not random. As the MPs restrained Coda and pulled him back, Elijah bent to pick up the shredded patch that had come loose in Coda's teeth. It was a hidden layer of fabric sewn into the uniform lining. Why would a senior officer carry that kind of concealment? He flipped the strip over. There was a dried smear of blood on the inside, so old it had crusted into the fabric weave. A field tag was stitched along the edge in faint ink. Elijah's chest tightened as he read 721-J/Alpha_3. The room froze. Naomi's voice broke the silence. "That blood, if it's his, we can match it." She turned to the tribunal. "I'm requesting immediate DNA verification against Cross's prior sample from personnel records." One of the judges nodded grimly. A forensic unit was called in without delay. The sample was collected under armed supervision. Strayer silent now, jaw clenched, eyes darting between the dog, Elijah, and Naomi, like someone who'd suddenly realized the noose had begun to tighten. 2 hours passed in near silence, broken only by the ticking of an analog clock and the low hum of the HVAC unit overhead. Coda sat motionless, eyes fixed on the door. Elijah hadn't said a word, his mind racing back through every briefing, every redacted file, every twitch in Strayer's carefully rehearsed lies. Then the door opened, and a forensic officer stepped in with a printed report in her gloved hand. She handed it to the judge. The judge scanned it, then looked up slowly. The blood found on Colonel Strayer's internal sleeve matches the DNA of Sergeant Julian Cross, previously listed as KIA under Operation Shepherd Vantage. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Naomi spoke first. Then the question becomes, how did a dead man's blood end up inside the uniform of a man who claims never to have met him? Elijah stood. Because he didn't just meet him, he said, voice low, steady like a sniper's breath before the shot. He buried him, or tried to. Strayer's hand moved subtly toward his inner jacket. Elijah clocked it instantly. "He's reaching," he shouted, diving across the table. But Coda was already in motion. The dog slammed into Strayer's side again, knocking the colonel against the wall, sending a concealed injection pen skidding across the floor. The MPs pounced. One retrieved the device. Inside was a translucent blue serum unmarked, but Elijah recognized it. The same kind used during neural dampening protocols described in the Glasswolf logs. Strayer was disarmed, arrested, and placed under maximum confinement. The trial chamber erupted in questions, commands, and military protocols scrambling to save face. But it was already too late. Koda had exposed the truth the way only he could, by instinct, by memory, by something no override protocol could erase. Naomi retrieved the collar fragment again and placed it beside the shredded sleeve. The tribunal stared at the two matching identifiers, one worn by a dog, the other hidden by a traitor. Elijah leaned in close to Koda. "You remembered him, didn't you?" The dog nudged his chest, eyes full of something ancient. Not training, not programming. Recognition. But there was one piece still missing, the coordinates Cross had tried to transmit, the last node listed in the note card. It wasn't on any map, until Koda sat down in front of the tribunal table and raised his paw twice, then pressed his snout against Naomi's laptop screen, tapping a blank spot near the northern corridor. A ghost facility, one last bunker, unregistered, forgotten. But not to him. The room was quiet again, not from tension or mourning, but from the kind of silence that follows an explosion too large for sound. Colonel Strayer had been led away in restraints, but the impact of what he left behind rippled like aftershocks through the tribunal and beyond. The tribunal had recessed for 12 hours to deliberate on the implications, with Naomi poring over everything they'd collected. The fabric samples, the GPS marks Koda had pressed into her laptop, the residual identifiers from the injection pen, and the visual proof that the cover-up had not only been coordinated, but compartmentalized to the highest levels of military authority. Elijah had sat in the holding room just off the main hall, wrists uncuffed for the first time, but still under heavy guard. The air was dry, reeking of legal sweat and institutional doubt. Across from him, Naomi sat with her arms crossed, watching him in silence. "You're gonna offer you a deal," she said finally. "Walk away, plead insanity, PTSD, behavioral manipulation from the canine neural exposure. Let the story die with Strayer and walk out in 6 months with an honorable discharge." Elijah didn't look at her. "And in exchange?" Naomi's gaze was hard. "You don't testify, you surrender the USBs. You let them bury everything we just unearthed." Elijah exhaled through his nose, his hand resting gently on the dog didn't move. Naomi stood and walked toward him. "They're scared. Not just of the fallout. Of you. Because you remember. And worse, because he remembers too." She gestured at Koda. "But if you speak, they will crucify you. You're still a sergeant who defied orders. Who breached military firewalls. Who allegedly led an armed dog into a federal building. They will twist it, and if they fail, they will bury you for real this time." Elijah looked up, his eyes tired but burning. "If I stay quiet, I let every soldier after me get used the same way. I let Cross die nameless. I let Koda's memories get overridden like data. And I let the people who designed this whole machine walk away with promotions." Naomi didn't flinch. "Then you have to choose now." He nodded slowly. "I already did." The chamber was smaller this time, cleared of unnecessary personnel. Only the core tribunal members, Naomi, the prosecution, a clerk, and Elijah. The room felt colder, as though judgment itself had a temperature. Elijah rose when asked and took his place on the witness platform. The lead judge looked down, not coldly but wearily. "Sir Jason Elijah Moore, you stand here not only as a soldier, but as a man whose actions have shaken the foundations of trust within our military structure. You've been offered the opportunity to abstain from further testimony and accept a revised discharge under medical consideration. Do you accept these terms?" Elijah stood straighter. "No, sir, I do not." A flicker of motion crossed the judge's face. "Then you understand that continuing this path may result in charges of espionage, obstruction, and conspiracy against military command?" Elijah nodded once. "I do. And yet you proceed? Because the truth is not optional." Naomi's eyes didn't leave him. The prosecutor sat rigidly, already preparing rebuttals. But before a word could be uttered, Koda, who had been lying calmly at Elijah's feet, suddenly rose. His ears twitched, his nose flared, then, without hesitation, he walked slowly across the room, past Elijah, past Naomi, past the silent tribunal, until he stopped at the coat rack near the back corner where Strayer's uniform had been temporarily stored for evidence. Koda sniffed, pawed once at the left shoulder seam, then growled low and deliberate. Elijah moved instinctively, crossing the room as guards shifted uncomfortably. Naomi followed. Koda pressed his snout again into the seam of the folded uniform jacket, then tugged once sharply. A faint tearing sound followed. From the lining, a small object fell to the floor. A black USB no larger than a bullet casing. Naomi picked it up with a gloved hand. What the hell? She turned to the tribunal. Permission to access this now, live. The judge gave a terse nod. Proceed. They slotted the USB into the secure terminal. The screen came to life. There were no passwords, no encryption, just a folder titled Shepard__full. Inside was a video file. Naomi clicked. The feed was dated 2 years prior. It opened with a boardroom dim lighting, projector glare. 6 men seated, including Colonel Strayer. Rhodes stood at the front, pointing to a digital map. His voice, clear and confident, filled the chamber. With behavioral override complete, Phase 2 will allow us to embed operatives in civilian sectors using handlers unaware of the latent conditioning in their own K9s. Loyalty control at a subneural level. No rebellion, no conscience. Full obedience. Another man leaned forward. What about the handlers? The veterans? Rhodes shrugged. Disposable. If they ask too many questions, they're routed to psychological processing centers and replaced. A different voice chimed in. What about trial fallout? Strayer answered this time. There won't be any. We bury the assets before they know they were compromised. Then the camera panned to a third screen where biometric readings scrolled. One subject's name stood out in glowing red. Cross J-alpha integration rejected. Status unstable, recommend termination. The video ended. Elijah didn't speak. No one did. Until the youngest judge whispered, Jesus. Naomi turned to the bench. There it is. Operational proof, direct planning, clear intent to deceive, manipulate, and weaponize both soldiers and K9s, and eliminate anyone who got in the way. Coda returned to Elijah's side and sat down. And for the first time in hours, no one moved to restrain him. The tribunal reconvened in absolute silence. The weight of the video evidence still thick in the air like the residue of a battlefield. Naomi stood at full height as she delivered her final statement, measured and cutting, calling not for vengeance but for accountability. The judges recessed for just under an hour before returning with the verdict. All prior charges against Sergeant Elijah Moore were to be dismissed with prejudice. His record cleared of any association with treason or misconduct. The court formally recognized the illegitimacy of the Glass Wolf Project and its concealed operations, citing severe breaches of ethical protocol and unauthorized human testing. But while the ruling exonerated Elijah, the Department of Defense, through its legal liaison, filed an addendum to the verdict, stating that due to the politically sensitive nature of the operation and its surrounding publicity, Elijah would not be reinstated into active duty. His rank would be preserved on paper, his pension honored, but his service would be permanently archived, sealed, removed from all public-facing rosters. In short, they gave him back his name but not his voice. Elijah stood at the edge of the tribunal chamber, with Coda at his side, watching the last of the officials file out, their faces unreadable behind polished glass and regulation silence. Naomi approached him, her expression tight with restrained fury. They gave you justice and then turned it into a footnote. Elijah nodded. That's what they do. She hesitated, then added, you could fight it, there are appeals, political pressure, a wave of media support if we go public. Elijah looked down at Coda and dragged this dog through another 3 years of courtrooms, headlines, and sealed corridors. No. I've spent enough time being a story told by people who never bled with us. Naomi's jaw clenched, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her briefcase and handed him a sealed folder. Private grants, a few names, quiet donors, people who saw what happened. If you still want to do something real. Elijah took the folder, tucked it under his arm, and extended his hand. Naomi didn't shake it, she pulled him into a hug instead. We never had a chance, did we? She whispered. Elijah closed his eyes. Maybe this was the chance. 3 months later, under a flat autumn sky stained gold with light, Elijah stood on the porch of a modest facility nestled at the edge of the Smoky Mountains, its wooden beams still smelling of fresh sawdust, its sign newly hung above the gate, Second Watch. The blueprints came from an animal behaviorist who used to consult with Fort Sable before walking away from government contracts. And the name? That came from Coda. He'd always been the second set of eyes when no one else was watching. The center was built not as a kennel but a sanctuary, a hybrid of rehabilitation clinic and tactical training ground. It wasn't about turning dogs into weapons again. It was about restoring what the program had taken from them: agency, peace, memory. Elijah walked the grounds every morning at sunrise, Coda trotting beside him, no longer under command, but still, always at his flank. They had restored 4 dogs already, each one a discarded soldier labeled unfit, unresponsive, or worse, unstable. But Elijah had looked into their eyes and seen something familiar. The same haunted stillness he'd carried since Cross vanished. The same quiet scream for someone to see beyond the scars and protocol. On the 5th morning after the center officially opened, Elijah stood on the training field as the gates creaked open and a truck pulled up slowly. Naomi stepped out of the passenger side, dressed in jeans and a flannel, her badge nowhere in sight. "They're ready," she called out, her bass catching in the morning chill. The rear gate of the truck opened and 7 German shepherds stepped down one by one, black and tan, scarred and silent. Each had a tag clipped to their harness. None barked, none whimpered. They simply walked forward in a line and stopped 5 feet from Elijah's forward, waiting. Elijah looked at Coda. The old soldier stood perfectly still, then turned his head toward the new arrivals. After a pause, he walked forward, slow and deliberate, then sniffed before the first dog in the line. He sniffed, circled, made no sound, then moved to the next, and the next. When he reached the last dog, he paused, pressed his head gently against the younger shepherd's chest, then turned around and walked back toward Elijah. Then, for the first time in months, he barked. Once. Elijah nodded, understanding the signal without needing words. He turned to Naomi, who stood beside the gate, arms folded, watching everything. "He approves," he said simply. Naomi smiled. "Then they're yours now." Elijah looked back at the 7 dogs, all now sitting in quiet formation, eyes locked on him, waiting. He walked toward them, each step Bifgam's low and heavy with memory, until he stood before. "You've been through hell," he said softly, "but this is not the end of your war. This is the beginning of your return." Coda stood beside him again. Elijah looked out across the field, the sun just breaking over the treetops, casting long shadows like reminders of the past and paths forward. And there, in the silence of that golden morning, 7 broken soldiers waited to be whole again. And the one who had never left their side, the one who had never forgotten, stepped forward, not as a handler, not as a master, but as a comrade reclaimed by purpose. Coda walked ahead of them. Elijah followed. The light behind them grew stronger. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more cinematic narratives like this one. Drop a like to support the journey. I'm curious what part of the story hit you the hardest. And where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Your voice is part of this story now.